So this meeting is going to be recorded and live streamed on YouTube, so we can have we may have some questions from the people who are watching us on YouTube also. And the meeting is part of our research project, recent research project that we started at the Center for Research on North America. This project is called Diaspora Communication and Diplomacy, Perspectives from the Reception Context in the Americas, Europe, and Asia. And this is a collaboration with the GRFDT, the Global Research Forum on Diasporas and Transnationalism. This project is meant for 3 years. We hope we can keep collaborating after that. It has maybe I would mention 3 types of work that we will do in the project. One of them is the seminar, the monthly seminar, in one session in English and one session in Spanish. Then we have a laboratory on communication, migration communication that will start in maybe in the autumn. And then we also have some studies on art and activism around migration. In this seminar, we are trying to complement the state-centric perspective in diplomatic studies and understand in a complex way the relationship between diplomacy and human mobilities. And when we talk of diplomacy, we always think of course, alternative diplomacy, not only state-centric diplomacy. That said, this is a project. I welcome everybody, and I will give the floor to Antonio, who will present our speaker today. This Antonio is from the University of Granada, also Mexican of origin, and he's also the co-organizer of this session. Please, Anton.
Thank you, Camelia. Welcome to everyone to the second session of the seminar. So it is glad to see all of you here. So before we start the talk of Professor Wellman, let me give you a short view about his interesting career in these topics about diplomacy and diversity experiences of all these kind of discussions. So Professor David Joseph Wellman is a professor and director of the University School of Applied Diplomacy at DePaul University. His work focuses on the relationship between diplomacy and religion, ecological sustainability, and interconventional engagement. Wellman is the author of Sustainable Diplomacy, Ecology, Religion, and Ethics in Muslim-Christian Relations, published by Palgrave Macmillan in 2004, and Sustainable Communities, published by World Council of Churches in 2001. Wellman's writing on diplomacy was used as the basis for an international conference whose outcomes was the collaborative volume Sustainable Diplomacies, edited by Kostas Konstantinou and Jesse Dorian, published by Palgrave Macmillan in 2010. His more recent work has focused on European Union integration, non-state actors, and grassroots diplomacy and religious cultures' role in building bridges across boundaries of difference. Wellman's current book project focuses on interconventional diplomacy among non-state actors and grassroots diplomacy. Professor David Wellman, thank you for your time and support for this academic activity. The floor is yours.
Thank you so very much. Well, I just want to say I'm so delighted to be here with all of you, and thank you so much for having me. And so I guess I should say good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to you, depending on where you're receiving this transmission. And of course, I want to express my gratitude to Antonio and Camelia for their kind invitation to share a few reflections with you on the subject of citizen diplomacy and its possible futures. So in the course of my remarks today, I want to address a number of themes. The first is in the form of a question. How is diplomacy traditionally defined? And how have contemporary scholars of diplomacy broadened the traditional definition? Secondly, I want to turn to the concept of citizen diplomacy and then speak to what I think is one of the most promising developments in the study and practice of diplomacy, and that is the new language of diplomacy, which I will argue is emerging from the global environmental crisis, language which has significant implications for the role diplomacy can play through many different contexts associated with diasporas. Finally, I'd like to propose that the most promising future of diplomacy itself is found in the cultivation of a deeper collaboration among practitioners of the three principal types of diplomacy, which strikes me with this audience, many of you already know, so I hope I'm not being redundant here. But that would be, of course, state-sponsored diplomacy, non-state actor diplomacy, and grassroots diplomacy. So generally speaking, when one thinks of the term diplomacy, the most common references which come to mind center on state-sponsored diplomacy. This is, of course, the diplomacy which is practiced by foreign service officers on behalf of their national governments they represent. Such practitioners' efforts most commonly focus on bilateral or multilateral relations, which involve a minimum of 3 states. As most people are aware, nation-state diplomacy is most commonly seen as a form of diplomacy practiced by elite actors, given the fact that state-sponsored diplomacy first emerged as a craft most often practiced by the nobility on behalf of monarchs or heads of state. And even today, many members of the contemporary diplomatic corps are drawn from dominant racial and religious groups of their respective nations. And their ranks are often dominated by people who enjoy the most privileged economic positions in their respective societies. This, I am happy to report, is changing. And this is the theme I want to look at a bit further into my remarks today. So there's a number of ways which diplomacy has been defined, and the following useful definitions are provided by some of the leading scholars in the field. So Ernest Satow, the 19th century British diplomat, defined diplomacy as, quote, the application of intelligence and tact to the conduct of official relations between independent states. Kostas Konstantinou, the contemporary Cypriot scholar of diplomacy, describes diplomacy as, quote, a practice which produces, secures, and transforms international systems and world orders. And Cornelia Bjola and Martin Komprost describe diplomacy as, quote, the institutionalized communication among internationally recognized representatives of internationally recognized entities, through which these representatives produce, manage, and distribute public goods. Now, while all of these definitions do an excellent job of describing some of the basic dimensions of nation-state diplomacy, diplomacy as it is practiced today includes and goes well beyond this understanding, I'm very happy to report. So Kostas Konstantinou, the Spaniard Noé Cornago, and the Irish geographer Fiona McConnell described in their groundbreaking book entitled Transprofessional Diplomacy that, quote, diplomacy is no longer restricted to a single vocation, nor implemented exclusively through interaction amongst official representatives. The transprofessionalization of diplomacy, they point out, reflects the expanded diplomatic space and the intensified pace of global interconnections and networks, and the new possibilities they unleash for practicing diplomacy in different milieus. So while DePaul University, where I work, is located in the United States, the curriculum of the School of Diplomacy, which I have the honor of directing, was actually inspired by the work of 3 Europeans, of Kostas, of Noé, and Fiona. And what the design of our school lifts up is the central premise of their book, namely that transprofessional diplomacy acknowledges that while diplomacy is practiced by nation-state representatives, it's also practiced by community organizers, artists, scientists, business people, religious leaders, educators, and activists, among others, and many of whom are often in a better position to address a number of the areas of conflict and build coalitions on the ground than traditional diplomatic representatives could ever aspire to be. So to this end, the Gray School trains its students to become practitioners of diplomacy in all of these vocations and more, actually. And our goal is to create cohorts of students who, upon graduation, acquire jobs in diplomacy at all levels, as state-sponsored professionals, non-state actor, and grassroots diplomatic practitioners. And our intention is for our graduates to complete their studies with an extensive network of practitioners among their fellow students who can address problems which no one type of diplomatic practitioner could ever hope to comprehensively address alone. And we've approached defining and training and the training of future diplomats in the manner we have for a variety of reasons. The most important among these is this. We feel that the most intractable problems we face as a planet will never be adequately resolved by any one single expression of diplomacy. So, for example, if state-sponsored diplomacy alone was going to solve the environmental crisis, then I submit it would have done so already. And that's because even if nation states were willing to collectively show the level of courage and creativity which will be required to craft and agree to treaties which truly protect the integrity of the ecosphere, the requirements of living out the obligations agreed to by nation-state representatives will require the coordinated efforts and commitments of millions, if not billions, of individuals committed to adhering to and interpreting how to meet the commitment of such agreements and live out the very granular obligations which would ensure that words on paper become facts on the ground. Now, such a feat will therefore require collaboration and coordination among many types of diplomatic actors. And it's crucial that they begin working together as soon as possible. And this is what we're trying to envision at our school. So at the same time, we must also bear in mind that the climate crisis is a major factor fueling current trends in human migration. So therefore, as we recognize the diplomatic obligations and opportunities which emerge through the interconnectedness of these two phenomena, the environmental crisis, the migration crisis, which to many northern countries view these as discrete, we must approach our understanding of diplomacy itself, I would argue, in a far more holistic manner. So in his article entitled Everyday Diplomacy, the Mission, Spectacle, and Remaking of Diplomatic Culture, Kostas Konstantinou asserts that, quote, diplomacy emerges whenever someone successfully claims to represent or negotiate for a territory or a group of people or a cause, or successfully claims to mediate between others, engaging in such representations and negotiations. This is where diplomacy ceases to be a professional skill, Kostas writes, or a special technique, and thus it captures a wider spectrum of social activities. The concept of everyday diplomacy opens the door to both seeing diplomacy all around us and entertaining the possibility that we ourselves are also quite capable of becoming practitioners of diplomacy. Now, as you might imagine, broadening the definition of diplomacy to include the work of people on the ground, that's the term I like to use to describe average citizens who will remain in place regardless of the government in power. It's highly problematic, this idea, to many traditionalists who are invested in reserving the practice of diplomacy to nation-state representatives. At the same time, this broader definition of diplomacy is also not readily adopted by those who prefer to see themselves as community organizers or activists. I work with many such people, and the first thing I say when I say to them, "I think you're a brilliant diplomat," they say, "Well, I'm an activist. I'm a community organizer," and so we have conversations about that. And one example is I recall being at Juma Prayers with one of my favorite citizen diplomats here in Chicago. His name is Rami Nashashibi. And he co-founded and leads an organization called the Inner City Muslim Action Network, or IMAN. IMAN meets the needs of residents in Inglewood, an economically and racially marginalized neighborhood on the south side of Chicago. And IMAN creates coalitions across multiple boundaries of racial, religious, and economic difference to do their work. IMAN has established a medical and dental clinic. They've created a green market. They've founded an art therapy program, and they are fighting for the reopening of a metro station in the neighborhood it serves. The people leading IMAN have also established what they call their Green Reentry Program, which trains formerly incarcerated individuals to rehabilitate abandoned buildings and turn them into affordable housing. I can't think of that many justice-oriented things being accomplished at the same time by a group, so I'm very impressed with this group. Now, IMAN, how has IMAN done this? IMAN has accomplished these goals by building a network of Muslims, Jews, Christians, atheists, African Americans, Latinx, and white Chicagoans who support and participate in their efforts in what is the highly segregated city of Chicago, where many people do not have friends outside those who share their same social location. So for this reason, on that day in the mosque, I told Rami that I thought he was one of the most brilliant diplomats I'd ever met. And his response was to say, "Oh no, David, I am definitely not a diplomat. My father was a diplomat in the Jordanian diplomatic corps. And for me, diplomats are men who drink whiskey and smoke cigarettes behind closed doors while making decisions for everyone else without consulting them." Now, in time, I believe I helped to persuade Rami to expand his definition of what he considers to be a diplomat and to see, in fact, what he is doing is a most vital form of diplomacy. And this is in keeping with what is coming to be known as the democratization of diplomacy. And this new understanding has, in my estimation, not come a moment too soon. For the world we live in is in desperate need of more people understanding themselves as practitioners of diplomacy. So why is this important? Why isn't it enough for these people who are activists or community organizers to view themselves simply as advocates for a group or a cause? I would submit that this is important because seeing oneself as a practitioner of diplomacy opens the door to giving oneself permission to practice what one does on an even larger scale, in concert with larger numbers of individuals and communities. Now, the British scholar of diplomacy, Paul Sharp, refers to the diplomat as the useful stranger, one who is not only of service to their own community, but by virtue of their skills, understanding, and worldview, is capable of being of real service to others who are not members of their own group. This person is also concerned with the sustainability of the larger social system. And when I say that, I mean the human and non-human dimensions of the social system. Such people use their abilities in mediation and negotiation to bring people to the table who were not originally drawn to sitting with those from other groups, let alone conversing or sharing a meal or working together to create communities and networks which no one person or group could have ever created on their own. So while everyday diplomacy can be seen as in the dialogical conversations of ordinary life, to truly practice diplomacy as a citizen diplomat is to, I would argue, to distinguish oneself from simply being an advocate for a particular cause. So to better illustrate my point, here are some of the qualities that I ascribe to those who successfully practice citizen diplomacy. They are people who have a deep capacity for empathy. They're willing to put their feet into the shoes of others and have the desire to try and see the world through other people's eyes. They see opportunities where others only see challenges or obstacles. They're able, when necessary, to rein in their emotions and withhold their opinions in order to more effectively present as neutral, in order to work with a broad spectrum of individuals and groups. They see the well-being of others as directly connected to their own well-being. They have the courage to admit when they're wrong, and they find joy in learning from others. They've acquired the ability to practice mediation and negotiation. They speak more than one language. And when I say more than one language, I do not simply mean languages that involve words and grammar, but I'm talking about cultural languages and physical languages and artistic languages. These people also have intellectual curiosity and intellectual humility. Humility is foundational to being successful in diplomacy. Citizen diplomats also have the capacity to create neutral and beautiful spaces where they invite different sides in conflict to come together. Such people are active, engaged listeners who receive other people's stories and value them as much as their own. I also love that really great citizen diplomats don't define winning as getting everything they want. And they're also fully aware that they're not objective, nor the sole purveyors of truth. And of course, in light of what I told you about Paul Sharp, they aspire to become a useful stranger, as Sharp has described, in order that they are able to not only perform service for those from their own geographic or social location, but also on behalf of those with whom they do not share a common race, gender, ethnicity, religion, ideology, or economic class. They also have the ability to recognize and abide by the prevailing etiquette of all the spaces they enter into and communities with whom they engage. Citizen diplomats have the ability to help create fortify, and sustain communities and networks of communities who work together for a common goal. Such people are culturally literate, first and foremost in their own geographic location, and also in those of others. And very importantly, they become quickly aware when they lack such literacy. And when this is the case, they move directly to educating themselves by seeking appropriate teachers. Citizen diplomats are open to being transformed by the practice of diplomacy. This is something that Noé and Kostas have explored quite extensively. And through encountering and working with those whose social locations are entirely different than their own, they become people that they were not before they began this practice. And ideally, citizen diplomats are able or interested in acquiring the ability to work with state-sponsored, non-state, and grassroots diplomatic actors. And we've reached a point now where the idea of segregating yourself as a diplomat, a particular practitioner, I mean, that is a luxury, I think, that one can no longer indulge in if one wants to get things done. Now, mind you, I recognize there are certain groups that are doing things that they're not going to want to reach out to state-sponsored diplomats. There's certain state-sponsored diplomats that have reservations about that. But as I said at our school, we're trying to create a space where people can come together to do this work. So as we watch the accelerated growth of divides between people, of suspicion of those who are seen as other by dominant groups, or the leveraging of such fear on the part of those who see the promotion of such divisions as a political opportunity to secure power, it's increasingly apparent that such efforts to promote dialogue and bridge building cannot be limited to those who are already ideologically predisposed to doing such work. We need to reach a broader cross-section of people and invite them into these efforts. And we need to do it as soon as possible. My fellow faculty member at the Gray School, Jeffrey Wiseman, along with Paul Sharp, edited a book entitled The Diplomatic Corps as an Institution of International Society. In it, they make the argument that those who choose to become diplomats comprise a body of people who form a transnational community, through which the nations of the world have the possibility of cooperating. This book also serves to illustrate that by becoming members of a diplomatic service, many people enter into what could be called an liminal space, where in certain respects they come to have more in common with diplomats from other countries than they do with their own fellow citizens. The same could be said for the citizen diplomat, who as a group have the possibility of coming to see themselves as comprising what I like to call the citizen diplomatic corps. So citizen diplomacy opens the door to the possibility of embracing diplomacy in its most idealized form, as a means entirely devoted to the prevention of conflict, the reduction of violence, the work of peace building, the healing of rifts, the dissolution of false perceptions, and the building of bridges across multiple boundaries of difference. So why do I think that it's important for non-state actor and grassroots practitioners of diplomacy to see themselves not only as activists or community organizers, but also, or practitioners of dialogue, but also as diplomats? And that's because I think that it's through claiming this title, or at least feeling comfortable when others use it, that one learns to value their work and what they bring to the table even more than they already do. And in doing so, as I've already mentioned, this opens the door to inviting a broader audience to do the same, with an eye to working on a much larger scale than ever before. So my invitation for such people to name themselves as diplomats is not intended as a means of gaining prestige, as some would equate with the idea of diplomacy, but rather as a way to connect what these people do to a bigger project, one that is central, I would argue, to many things I believe most people value. So, as I mentioned earlier, the environmental crisis will never be solved by the work of any one level of diplomats working alone. Environmental sustainability, and with it, the political, social, cultural, and economic sustainability upon which it depends, will only be achieved by the simultaneous efforts of individuals working on an intimate level to build consensus among neighbors, family members, and colleagues at work and school. It is for this reason that I view the environmental crisis as among the most pivotal opportunities we've ever been provided to embrace the practice of diplomacy on a deeper level than we have thus far imagined possible. So when I meet a new student, I'm often guilty of saying to them, I've never met you before, but I already know three things about you. I know that you need clean air, potable water, and arable land to survive, and you cannot have any of those things unless you're willing to work and play well with others, even those you disagree with or don't even like. So in this regard, the environmental crisis has provided us with a new language of diplomacy. And unlike the 19th century diplomatic language of French, it is a language every one of us already speaks. For words such as air, water, and land exist in every language, and establishing the critical nature of all three of these elements does not require persuasion or debate. People are already there. So these realities led me to define what I call sustainable diplomacy as the practice of diplomacy which privileges the work of earth scientists, religious studies, anthropology, and linguistics to build bridges between elites and people on the ground. It acknowledges that the fact that state-sponsored diplomacy is not going away, and thus it invites us to look at the work of citizen diplomats as one crucial layer of diplomatic practice, which, if combined with the work of state-sponsored and non-state actors, has the potential to achieve many more diplomatic objectives. There are, of course, important distinctions between state-sponsored and non-state actor diplomatic practitioners. While state-sponsored diplomats are, as a rule, strongly discouraged from remaining in any one country long enough to develop personal ties to any nation state or its people, sustainable diplomacy views its citizen practitioners as go-betweens who are influenced or even captured by their host nation. The citizen diplomat is thus open to becoming embedded and invested in the cultures and peoples she or he engages, in order to understand the realities of people on the ground with a new level of granularity. At the same time, citizen diplomats practicing sustainable diplomacy must recognize their own subjectivities and the manner in which their own social locations impact their perceptions of the people, history, and circumstances which they are obliged to interpret. Now, while in the global north, we are taught that nation-state borders, which are human creations, are the ultimate demarcation, the sustainable diplomat acknowledges that it is one's bioregional identity which is paramount, and which acknowledges that we are already in community with those we might have previously seen as different or other. I examined this notion in my work on Morocco and Spain, which I see on many levels as one contiguous country. I can most certainly see the same arrangement with regards to the United States and Mexico, especially considering a huge part of the United States used to be Mexico, which is still news to many Americans. So there's been a great deal of fascinating work in the field of diplomatic studies, which illumines the logic and power of viewing diplomatic engagements through such lenses. The work of Antonio ALEJO with us today has examined what he refers to as migrant diplomacy, which, as most of you I suspect are aware, sees migrants as diplomatic actors, building living bridges between Mexico and the United States, among other contexts. Underscoring the logic of Antonio's analysis, the Spaniard Noé Coronado is among a group of scholars who have explored the phenomenon of paradiplomacy, which examines the work of sub-state actors on either side of nation-state borders, as engaging in vital forms of diplomacy, which elude the grasp of nation-state actors. Now, in this view, people who live on either side of the German-French border, such as in Strasbourg, France, or Offenburg, Germany, actually have more in common with each other than can arguably work together with more ease and understanding than their national representatives in Berlin or Paris. Looking at diplomacy through the lens of the environmental crisis also opens the door to considering the limitations of what have been seen as quote-unquote traditional sources of power. Political realism, a long popular Northern great powers approach to interpreting international relations, has long emphasized the primacy of military or economic power. However, the environmental crisis and the interconnected phenomenon of human migration invite us to consider different understandings of power, such as the capacity to live sustainably within the very real limits of the ecosphere. Many environmental thinkers point to what they see as the false premises of what they call the human economy, which prints money detached from value. Conversely, they point to the veracity of Earth economy, which can be understood by its finite and very measurable amounts of potable water or hectares of arable land. It is within the latter of these two which we must now live. In this view, those countries which must purchase, coerce, or steal the resources of other nations to survive are in fact the weakest countries of all and highly vulnerable to disruption. At the same time, we must acknowledge that the global South is arguably a greater repository of knowledge regarding how to live sustainably within one's regional means, and thus, through the lens of ecological realism, is actually more powerful than the global North. So looking at diplomacy through an ecological lens also opens the door to identifying and drawing on some of the most powerful sources available to invite people to collective action. Their extant beliefs regarding not only the material value of the ecosphere, but also its moral and spiritual value. Such an understanding of what people believe requires a sophisticated understanding of cultures, including religious cultures. When I say religious culture, I'm not simply speaking of the influence or beliefs of people who are actual practitioners of a religious tradition. Rather, I'm talking about the notion that even the most secular people are influenced in many ways by the religious histories of their countries, in terms of how they use language, how they make moral claims, or in the ways they language their notions of justice and right relationship. The most effective citizen diplomat should therefore have a sophisticated understanding of these religious cultures and the intended histories of the people they wish to successfully engage. Sustainable diplomacy also opens the door to examining how the practice of diplomacy by people on the ground in shared environments can affect change in areas state-sponsored diplomacy cannot. This work includes the building of bridges across boundaries of race, ethnicity, economic class, religion, and gender, through the identification of commonly held goals, and in many cases through leveraging commonly held or complementary moral and ethical claims which reflect such goals in the name of inspiring collective action. The environmental crisis suggests a number of such common goals, focusing on the survival of both human and non-human communities. It is from these common goals that a new language of diplomacy is emerging, one rooted in our common requirements for survival, and actualized through the identification of common convictions. Such convictions, deeply held beliefs, which are positive beliefs, when leveraged, can result in cooperation among actors, communities, and organizations, which are not always predisposed to collaboration. This reality opens the door to harnessing the power of what is referred to as interconvictional relations, in the service of moving more rapidly in the direction of environmental sustainability. So this brings us to a consideration of what I call the interconvictional dimension of citizen diplomacy. This term interconvictional, coined by the French physicist Francois Becker, emerged from the context of interfaith efforts spearheaded in Europe, where a large percentage of the inhabitants are actually secular. So while interfaith initiatives have opened the door to building bridges among those of different religious traditions, these efforts, particularly in Europe, were often simultaneously to create a context for building bridges across all the boundaries I've mentioned: racial, ethnic, economic, gender, and generational. But the term interconvictional is bigger. It embraces the work of interfaith relations, and it expands it to include agnostic and atheist individuals and groups, based on the belief that all people have equally valuable convictions. And many of those convictions complement each other, something which provides the foundation for cooperation and collaboration when such convictions share common ethical claims or strategic goals. The growing visibility of the environmental crisis has impacted the work of diplomacy on multiple fronts, whether this be in the form of urban communities embracing the project of combating food deserts, by the use of community gardens and the promotion of green markets, the adoption of urban aquaculture, or city councils enacting municipal ordinances, which require a far more robust commitment to material sustainability. All of these are supported by commonly held convictions, which cut across distinctly different social locations. Here in the United States, the reality of environmental racism is also a phenomenon which has galvanized action by practitioners of what we call urban diplomacy. At the Gray School, we define urban diplomacy as diplomatic acts which take place within the boundaries of a single city, which may or may not have international implications. In the United States and Europe, urban diplomacy can come in the form of activists and community organizers, among others, building bridges across boundaries of racial, ethnic, religious, and economic difference. Their work endeavors to push back against the long history of white communities signing off on decisions which place communities of color in entirely different ecological realities than their dominant group counterparts. When we consider the work of citizen diplomats in the practice of sustainable diplomacy, we're clearly not just talking about the sustainability of resources. We're also talking about the work of making real human communities sustainable, politically, socially, economically, and spiritually. There are so many practitioners of citizen diplomacy who I admire immensely. Two such figures our school hosted last year as our practitioners in residence, and they were Ilya Sikroski and Mohammed Abu Bakr. Mohammed Abu Bakr grew up in Khartoum, Sudan, and at the age of 14, he was documenting genocide in his country. He established the African Middle Eastern Leadership Project, or AMEL, which has created a network of millennial and Gen Z leaders across the Middle East and Africa who reject the views of their parents, who often say peace and cooperation are not possible. AMEL equips these young people with the skills necessary to effectively advocate for democracy and push back against those who use violence and fear to divide people. To this end, Mohammed created the AMEL Institute, a school with students and teachers from around the world who meet in virtual spaces where young people are trained with practical knowledge and skills so they can carry out their civil society activism and fight sectarian violence more safely and effectively. The person who came with Mohammed last year to our school, Ilya Sikroski, is a Vienna-based Jewish activist who established the Muslim Jewish Conference, a network of Muslims and Jews who help to support, share tactics, and inspire interconvictional work across 5 continents. What began as a project that created a space for Jews and Muslims to meet and form friendship networks, the MJC has become a transnational NGO with members working in 65 countries. The MJC creates meeting grounds for Muslim and Jewish bridge builders and their allies to exchange strategies, learn new skills, and encourage and empower one another. Ilya was inspired to found the MJC as a student when he met his first Muslim friend. Before meeting Ilya, the young Pakistani man he met had never met a Jew. As they began to get to know each other, they learned how many lies they'd been told about each other's respective groups. Ilya's establishing the MJC was also inspired by the rise of the far right in Europe, whose success he saw as coming in no small part due to their engaged networking. As a German Jew whose family was forced to live through the Holocaust, Ilya realized that progressive people have to out-network those who aim to divide people, and on an even grander scale. And as an aside, I'll say that I'm involved in the MJC. We have many Palestinian and Israeli members who work together and who love each other very much and who are weathering what's happening now. It's very, very challenging, very difficult, but I see a future that is completely different than I see in the newspaper headlines right now by virtue of being in these rooms. I see what I hope are the future leaders of the Palestinian and Israeli people. And then I want to mention one more citizen diplomat for you, someone I believe you all know, and that would be Greta Thunberg, whose weekly climate strikes, transatlantic voyage, and the coordinated global responses it inspired serve to highlight the potency of an ecologically driven citizen diplomacy, one which has inspired millions to see that building transnational bridges across boundaries of difference is no longer the sole purview of the traditional diplomat, nor is it limited to those of voting age. Greta has accomplished these things not in spite of her age or the fact that she lives with Asperger's, but rather, in my estimation, because of who she is. Greta's work has not only served to call a new level of attention to the degradation of our planet, it's served to create a highly diverse network of people who are united by their common commitment to compelling and inspiring people to become local, regional, and transnational leaders in demanding that our governments, businesses and fellow citizens adopt sustainable practices and worldviews. Now, in case you're tempted to believe that Thunberg's work is superficial, it should be noted that within a year of her standing alone outside the Swedish parliament with a sign calling for a student strike, over 4 million people were marching in the cities around the world echoing her message. And within less than 2 years of her original solo demonstration, on the 21st of February 2019, the president of the European Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker, stated in a public declaration his intent to spend hundreds of billions of euros on climate change mitigation, amounting to 1/4 of the EU budget. He announced this in a speech standing next to Greta Thunberg, whose presence served to add legitimacy to Juncker's declaration. Now, the work of citizen diplomacy is making noteworthy contributions in many areas. One which particularly interests me is the potential of citizen diplomacy to help counter the ways in which populist movements around the world are leveraging the fear of migrants to gain power. Josep Borrell, the EU's top diplomat, was recently quoted in The Guardian, it was last September, as saying that migration could well be the catalyst for the dissolution of the European Union, as figures such as Orbán, Le Pen, Maloney, and champions of Brexit or the AfD, among many others, continue to gain power by leveraging fear of difference, particularly of migrants. And as you well know, I don't have to go outside the United States to witness this same socially toxic and highly effective tactic, which are central to both the ideology and policy proposals promoted by Donald Trump and his MAGA movement. I would argue that many practitioners of diplomacy who work in non-state and grassroots contexts are in a better position to address the phenomenon of migration and its weaponization than any state-sponsored diplomat could accomplish alone. Such groups are the ones on the ground. It is individuals who will choose or not choose to open their doors to those who come from other countries, seeking safety from violence and or political persecution or economic opportunities not afforded them in their countries of origin. It is individuals who know the names of the neighbors who must be brought together to welcome and help to integrate those who arrive from other countries. And such people will still be there after the next election or the next coup d'etat, regardless of who is in power. In this regard, citizen diplomats are arguably among the most important expressions of diplomacy now. So whether it's through the efforts of practitioners of migrant diplomacy, those who welcome migrants, the work of Black Lives Matter, and those it collaborates with transnationally, or Greta Thunberg's climate strikes, movements which on their face appear to be purely those of activist efforts are in fact highly dependent upon sophisticated, often taken for granted acts of citizen diplomacy to build the coalitions which they have, which have gathered highly diverse groups of people of not just hundreds of thousands of people, but millions. Our ongoing efforts at the Gray School are designed to lift up the work of citizen diplomats as exemplars of what now must be done. At the same time, we endeavor to create a space where state-sponsored, non-state actor, and grassroots practitioners can learn from one another with a view to cultivating a deeper level of collaboration. Such collaboration must become central to our diplomatic efforts to meaningfully engage the most pressing problems we face as a planet. The growing phenomenon of human migration continues to test the very real limits of what has been traditionally defined as diplomacy. The social fractures brought on by fear of difference and the subsequent rise of far-right movements, which leverage this fear to gain power, are a direct result of the failure of our collective diplomatic imagination to address not only the challenges, but the extraordinary opportunities being presented to us through diaspora communities and their increasing visibility across the globe. One of the most important responsibilities among us, I believe, is therefore not only to come to understand ourselves as citizen diplomats, with many gifts to bring to the table, we must also learn to recognize the many others engaged in this practice. We need each other. There are many diplomats around the world. You have no doubt seen many, but there are even more than you imagine who are pursuing many different vocations. It is therefore the task of all practitioners of diplomacy to cultivate their ability to identify such allies, such fellow diplomats, as we collectively endeavor to collaborate with more and more people. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, David. It's been a really overwhelming presentation, and I hope we can have a discussion with you. I have the privilege of chairing and intermediating this Q&A session. This was an excellent background for our project, for the implications of diaspora diplomacy, what are the challenges, and I particularly like this idea of contiguous countries, US and Mexico and Spain and Morocco. Perhaps we can talk more about it when there is an opportunity. Now I will take some questions and comments from you. I will start with the people who are here in the Zoom. I suspect there may be some people who want to ask or comment something on YouTube, but let's start here. I will take 3 questions and then get back to you, and so we go. When you get tired, you tell us and you leave us. So whoever wants to start. Everest, I see your hand, please. Go ahead.
Hello, thank you, David. Thank you for the organizers of this meeting. My question is about the language. David, you were talking about the importance of this element in the diplomacy. I would like to know, in your opinion, how the art or different art manifestations as a language can contribute to expand the liminality of diplomacy in this century. What can be the role of art, please, as a language, I mean, please.
Would you like me to answer this now, CAMELIA,
yes.
or would you like me?
Yes.
Okay, okay. Okay. Everest, thank you very much for your question. Well, I must say that art as a language, I think, opens the door to so many things. Now, historically, in the field of diplomatic studies, when we talk about art and diplomacy, we talk about such things as museum diplomacy. We talk about the way that embassies use art. We could even go back to the ancient roots of how art was used as gifts among delegations. There would be delegations that would actually debate and plan for years to decide what it was, what object they were going to bring to the group that they were seeing that would be reflective of both their culture and be demonstrably understood as honoring the other by giving it. But I think art is in a language. Well, you ask a really sophisticated question. How can art as a language expand the liminality in the practice of diplomacy? I mean, let me back up a moment and just say that I think the work of a really, truly great diplomat is, first of all, they must be a person who is comfortable in liminal spaces. And when I think about liminal spaces, these in-between spaces, I think the average person is terrified of liminal space. They want to be in familiar space. And if we're traveling between one familiar space and another familiar space, and we're traveling through this liminal space, we want to go as quickly as possible. And I think that what distinguishes the real diplomat is they seek out liminal spaces. And if they can't find them, they make them. And what does that mean then in making a liminal space? It means that I'm not inviting you to come to my house on my terms and play by my rules, and neither am I going to your house to subject myself to that arrangement, but we are coming into a liminal space where we create something together. And there's a brilliant citizen diplomat in Paris. Her name is Radia Bakouche. She's a Franco-Moroccan leader of a group called Coexiste, or she was. She's not the leader now. And she used to tell me that when she enters into sitting across the table from somebody from a different group, she assumes they have nothing in common. And she says that what we have in common is what we build together. And so how can art contribute to that? I think art is such a brilliant way of communicating. In many respects, we see so many examples historically and in the present tense of artists and art being used to build bridges across boundaries of countries and groups of people who are not supposed to have any relationship whatsoever. They're in a very antagonistic relationship. Perhaps they're not talking to one another. And we can look at all these examples of artists who have collaborated across these boundaries. And so I think about art as a language, as art as a is in many cases is a nonverbal language. I also see art as a way of inviting people to see those who create the art as holding things in common. There's a brilliant group in France called the Society of Friendship between Muslims and Jews, and it was put together by a Sephardic rabbi born in Marrakesh who spoke perfect Arabic, who was himself actually a former professional basketball player. He's a very striking guy, like about 6'6", with a big broad hat and a beard and whatnot. And he put together an art exhibit with a Muslim man. And what they wanted to do was to express the fact that both in Islam and Judaism, the divine cannot be expressed anthropomorphically. And so the divine must be expressed abstractly. And so they put together this art exhibit and invited young Muslims and young Jews to come and see the space. And I think what they did in doing that is they created a liminal space where people chose to come. They also made a catalog of this art that had no text, because they recognized that many of the people that they were trying to reach didn't read a written text. And so I think that art, and that's just one, these are just a couple very small examples, but I would reckon that if we looked around the room here, we could probably find a lot of other examples of how art can be used in that way. But I remain fascinated by the fact that, you know, museums collaborate across boundaries of difference when two countries are at odds. It involves a tremendous amount of negotiation to transport priceless works of art across international boundaries. And then we think about the spaces that are created when that art arrives in that other space. And so we could talk about popular culture art. We could talk about popular culture art as creating spaces. Here in Chicago, there's a couple neighborhoods, some of which Antonio has written about in his work. But in Pilsen, for example, there are so many beautiful murals of Latinx figures, both religious and political, that are on the walls. And I always tell my students that, you know, before you have any aspirations of going overseas and understanding another culture and speaking definitively to it, you need to go to Pilsen. And if you can't understand why people painted this mural of Guadalupe or Cesar Chavez, then you can't possibly go to Afghanistan and interpret Pashtun culture. And so I think it's an opening and it's an opportunity to talk, and it's non-threatening too. Like if you want to talk about art, it's often a way that it's not provocative. And so anyway, a very inadequate answer to your question, but there's so many more things we could talk about. But thank you for your question.
No, thanks. Okay, so we have one question from Vijay here in the chat. You can read it yourself. It says, I would like to hear from you about soft diplomacy, lobbying attempts of the diasporas and migrants for their homeland, sometimes leading to conflict situations. And then we have Juan Carlos and Mahalingam, Dr. Mahalingam. So please go ahead, first Juan Carlos and then Dr. Mahalingam.
Yeah,
Okay,
thank you. Am I audible? Can I answer? I mean, can I ask my question?
Yes.
Please.
Yeah. Thank you, Anthony. David, for wonderful lecture on diplomacy, deepening diplomacy. And my question is about how citizen diplomacy can help in mitigating global climate crisis, because the nation states are at loggerheads, and how citizen diplomacy can, expedite the finding solutions, to create the global framework for this global climate crisis.
Thanks. And then Juan Carlos, please.
Thank you, Camelia. Thank you very much, really, for this very thoughtful and interesting presentation. I have a lot of things to think about. We are working in a laboratory that seeking to analyze how different actors inform about migration. And we are very concerned about the role of social media, and we are worried because we would like to find a way to shift from hate discourses to empathetic discourses. That's our worry. So my question for you would be, what would be your opinion or thoughts about how to enhance communication among these actors, governmental and non-governmental actors? Can we identify communication bridges or something like that?
Okay, thank you very much for all these questions. So I can have a go at answering these three then, Camelia?
Please go ahead.
Okay. So let me start with the last one, Juan Carlos's question. I mean, I want to say, first of all, I share your concern about social media. I share your concern not only about social media, but a lot of mainstream for-profit media, which has certainly come to the conclusion, the market-driven conclusion, that they make more money and get more clicks if they put out really provocative things that inspire fear and resentment. And I can see this now in the headlines of the United States more and more. And I could blame a particular Australian man named Rupert Murdoch, but at this point now, the whole environment has been so transformed that it's a system-wide problem, it seems to me. I can't speak for the whole world, but I spent a lot of time, or have historically spent a lot of time in France. I see the style of media infecting the French media culture more and more. So how do we enhance, to use your words, enhance government and non-governmental cooperation among actors? Well, it's interesting, historically, the nation states that have been most predisposed to working with non-state diplomatic actors are states which have a high level of democracy and are generally middle power states, middle power and small power states. So they're not threatened by NGOs. Great power states, such as my country is still at this point, are historically very reluctant to work with non-state actors because, one, they've seen themselves historically as not having to, and secondly, if you've got states that have more authoritarian governments, they see these non-state actors as a threat to their legitimacy. They see non-state actors as potentially questioning issues of human rights and whatnot, and so they don't even want them. It was really hard to have that COP summit in Egypt when President Sisi did not want to have a lot of those NGO leaders in crossing the border in his country, and many were denied visas who were supposed to be at that conference. So that becomes an issue. But what I would say is that I think that too often we focus on the most contentious relationships, and we say, like, I really want to diplomatically engage this group, I can't, and therefore there's no possibility for diplomacy playing a role. And I think that is a very bilateral, very 180-degree view of diplomacy and potential. I think that people need to take a more 360 view and say, if I can't engage this particular group, be it a nation state, be it a non-state actor, I need to turn around and look at all of the people that I could be building a network with right now. And to me, some of the most fascinating developments in diplomatic practice that I'm witnessing are groups that are using their diplomatic power to create networks of people. I was quoting my friend Ilya Sikrovsky, and he's looking across Europe, and he sees all of this interconnectedness between these far-right groups. I mean, Vladimir Putin gave money to Marine Le Pen to help her in her election in France. And we can look at a lot of these networks. I'm certain that if we are able to write a comprehensive history of this period, we're going to be shocked at the level of cooperation and information sharing and money sharing that's been going on among those groups. But rather than lamenting that or simply wasting our time critiquing it, I would prefer to turn my attention to progressive groups that are advocating for democracy and human rights, and to take a page from the far right, become better organizers, become better networkers. And the fact of the matter is that we're at a place now, I think, at an inflection point where we need to spend our time identifying our agency, what it is that we are able to do, rather than lamenting what we cannot do. And I'll confess, I describe myself as a militant optimist. I think being an optimist is one of the greatest forms of resistance to things that we have issue with. And how do I do that? I can't do that by myself. I must be in community with other people who can see things I cannot see. And this is where I think the practice of diplomacy necessitates a deeper level of humility than most of us are willing to engage in of our own volition. So and I'm defining humility by being able to say, I don't know the answer to that question. I don't know how to do that. I can't do that by myself. And so, but the other thing with regards to networking, that's one answer to your question. But frankly, with regards to the idea of how do we straight up enhance government and non-governmental cooperation, I think that as things unfold, more and more state-sponsored actors are recognizing that they're going to have to work more comprehensively with citizen diplomats, or their whole project is going to fail. I mean, Joseph Borrell, that quote I gave you from Joseph Borrell, the head diplomat of the EU, I think he's correct. I think that if the EU does not completely reimagine how they engage the migrant issue, the EU is finished. And if they think they're having difficulties and destabilizations with the amount of migrants who've come to Europe, just wait until the people who are coming, the numbers that are coming will be much greater, particularly from sub-Saharan Africa. And so, so the time is now to start to work with some of the groups that I work with on the ground in Europe, people who are addressing issues of racial, religious, and economic difference, and building networks between those groups, because no state-sponsored actor is going to address fear of racial difference. They're going to be able to write a treaty, they're going to be able to negotiate, they might be able to close their borders for a while. But at the end of the day, it's the acts of citizen diplomacy, I think, that are going to allow many countries to carry on in a positive way. I mean, I look at the issue of the amount of people who've left Ukraine over the last 2 years, the largest human movement of displaced people since the Second World War, over 4 million people, maybe 5 now. I'm losing track of the numbers now. But how are those people surviving in other parts of Europe? They're being welcomed by people into their homes. And I'm not saying it's pretty and it works very well, but I'm just saying is that all these people on the ground have to be committed to doing this. And I have a number of Ukrainian friends who were welcomed into people's houses in Krakow after they crossed the border, and some of whom have made it to Chicago. We have a huge Ukrainian population here in Chicago. There's 250,000 people who are documented. So I think that it's a symbiotic relationship between the two. There's not one good answer to your question, but I think there's many intriguing responses to your question. So I hope I've given you a useful response, or something to begin a response to your question. The second one: how can traditional diplomacy mitigate climate change, and how can citizen diplomats help in this practice? I hope I'm characterizing that question correctly. So how can traditional diplomacy mitigate climate change? I mean, I think that there are many things that traditional diplomacy is doing that is moving in that direction. However, I can't speak for all countries, but I think that we have to grapple with the reality that many national governments and their practice of diplomacy have spent more time defending the interests of private sector actors than they have defending the interests of the planet. And so the question then becomes, how do we have more state-sponsored diplomacy that's actually willing to push things further than it has? Because I honestly don't think that we're going to spend our way out of this problem. We have to change the way that we do business. We have to change the way we understand business. I really like the juxtaposition of the human economy versus earth economy, because in so many respects, this human economy we've created is more of a fantasy thing. It doesn't work in the long term. But I also think that for those of us who still have the privilege of electing our governments, if you have a country where you can actually participate in elections, then you will get the government you deserve every time. The United States deserved Trump collectively, and not enough of us showed up to vote. A lot of people didn't show up to vote, and so in that regard, I think that it's on us as citizens to be very clear about who we are supporting in elections and what is their foreign policy. I think that so many populations vote for politicians exclusively based on their domestic policy and write their leaders a blank check to create whatever foreign policy suits them personally. And many times it's about self-enrichment. So I think that we must become more involved. But at the same time, having worked at the United Nations, I used to work at the World Council of Churches office at the UN. I helped lead delegations to the Sustainable Development summits. And I have to say, I'm extremely impressed at the spaces that are created. I will say, I will always defend the United Nations because I love the United Nations because it's a space where the poorest country in the world can send one representative, and that representative has the possibility of speaking to everybody. And I think there's always hope as long as there's spaces like that. But there's a lot of work for us to do as citizens. And for those people who are living in countries where you don't get to elect your heads of state, then I think the questions become different questions. And then we start talking about the use of networking and citizen diplomacy. And how can citizen diplomats mitigate the effects of climate change? Well, I think that even if, let's imagine tomorrow that there were a number of treaties that were signed by nation state representatives that if lived out would halt the rise of the rise of the median temperature of the planet. Well, that's not going to happen right away, because even if we all stop driving cars tomorrow, that number is going to continue to go up because of all the CO2 we've thrown into the atmosphere. But let's imagine that we wrote a series of treaties and they were agreed upon and ratified globally. None of them would succeed unless we persuaded people on the ground to live those out in their own lives and to use renewable energy more. And then, of course, people have to have access to that and have to be able to afford it. And so, I think that's also going to involve that some of the wealthiest countries in the world are going to have to involve themselves in free tech transfer to poorer countries. And that means India, China, the United States, the EU is going to have to stop being completely informed by a short-term, profit-driven model and have to make an investment. And I think the case can be made that, if you're killing your potential clients with pollution, there's going to be nobody to sell your products to anyway. And so it's really time for people to start making the connections. How can those connections be made? I would submit by citizen diplomats. Offering that connectivity, creating those things. And then my message to anybody who is despairing about who they have to vote for, who they have to choose to vote for, my answer is, well, when are you running for office? It's time to stop lamenting the options we have and become a part of the solution on a deeper level. And it's easy for me to say this as an American. I recognize that I have a lot of privileges where I can participate in my system in ways others cannot. But to the degree that people can, I think that is the answer. Again, a very inadequate answer to the very good question. The last question, the one that is put in the chat from Vijay Soni. You said that you'd like to hear about soft diplomacy, lobbying attempts of the diasporas and migrants for their homelands, sometimes leading to conflicting situations. I have to say that I don't feel that I am the expert in that particular area. It so happens there's somebody named Antonio ALEJO in this space that I think might have a better answer to that question than I do. But I will say, as a citizen of Chicago, I have to say that I'm extremely impressed at the ways that people who have come from Mexico to my city have had such a positive and rich impact on our city. I have had the pleasure of spending time recently with the Consul General of Mexico, who is a very dynamic woman, and the Dean of the Consular Corps actually in Chicago. And her connectivity with these communities and the way that they're representing Mexico, I think is very powerful and very positive. Now, I'm of course coming from a progressive perspective. And so, I'm going to see these things in a positive light, and I welcome migrants from other countries to my city, because I recognize the profound hypocrisy in not welcoming migrants in a country where we are all migrants if we are not Native American. Mind you, if you're part of the African diaspora, your ancestors were brought here against their will, so that's a different question. But as far as the majority of people, this welcoming is so crucial. But to the degree your question, lobbying attempts of the diasporas and migrants for their homeland, that is a question I don't feel I can give as adequate an answer to. So I'm wondering, Antonio, would you be willing to weigh in on this and rescue me here? Because this is where I'm going to exercise diplomatic humility and say I don't know the answer to that question as well as somebody else in the room.
I think Antonio left. He had to
Oh,
leave.
no.
Maybe he's listening on YouTube. But we have a
Okay.
very challenging question, another one here in the chat. I will read it. And then we have 3 more questions from colleagues here at the GRFDT. So I would read the one in the chat. It's regarding the relation between citizen diplomacy and democracy. From Professor Jeffrey Rice, he says, citizen diplomacy may not always contribute to democracy. Witness the impact of social media, which often spreads suspicion of democratic institutions. Who manages citizen diplomacy, and how can its progressive contribution be best realized? That's one comment. And then I will pass the word to Professor Bino, Patty, and then Professor Raj.
Okay, you want me to come in now?
Yes, please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you, Camelia. And Professor David, it was mesmerizing, I should say, to listen to you. And a lot of persuasion in terms of changing the world. And that's where my question arises. And although I share a lot of thoughts and writings on this, I do face and oftentimes get accusations in terms of pursuing utopia, and I guess that you perhaps might have also faced such questions. So, in fact, I was, impressed by listening to your using the same terminology that I have written about, in fact, particularly about in each other's shoes. And in fact, there is a published paper from IOM in 2017, which is titled In Each Other's Shoes, Making Migration Policies Equitable Across Borders. The word equitable is important in the sense that what I thought that citizen diplomacy that you have vouched for is something which leads to activism and public persuasion of the state actors. But the challenge that I have experienced in my interactions is interstate collaboration. The diplomatic corps that you mentioned are, driven by a false sense of sovereignty, where there is secrecy and confidentiality goes to the extent that when you are standing at the at the consulates and facing an interview with the visa officer is first thing that they are going to ask you your name. But in reciprocation, if you ask them, what's your name? You get a blank stare and say, we are not supposed to share that. And that's only a tip of the iceberg. And that's where I think the diplomatic corps are trained and skilled to outsmart each other. They play games with each other, where, and as you have rightly pointed out, that's basically in terms of getting an upper hand in, say, for example, global North versus global South. But these are also at the level of each country, trying to outsmart the other country. And that's where the challenge lies. And that's why I talked about in this paper a term called equitable adversary analysis. That equitable adversary analysis is nothing but stepping into each other's shoes with empathy to look at the problem from the other side. And that, I think, probably gives us a clue. I have recently, in fact, I attended the GCM debate, second debate. I was the thematic expert at United Nations in New York. And that's where I found that the multilateral negotiations actually boils down to the lowest level of equilibrium, because everybody has to raise their hand in support if it has to be passed. That I think, and that's where when you say that the poorest country also gets a year to be listened to, that I think is biased, because there are lobbies there. The so-called, we have seen this during WTO negotiations, when the so-called green rooms activities were confined to the global north countries. At that time, they were called developed countries, and the global south countries were all divided. They were not united. That's where I think the challenge lies, in terms of bringing them into some kind of a unified power to negotiate with the other unified power. In fact, when I talked about equitable adversary analysis, I found a similar term being used by the representative, migration representative to the Secretary General, called mini multilateralism. And that's where I think, for example, South Asia. The South Asian countries have so much of common in terms of boundaries, culture, ethnicity, religion, and so on, but still we are divided. And that's where your message perhaps gives us some clues, and where CAMELIA has mentioned and others have mentioned in terms of the spaces at the boundaries between Mexico and United States, between Canada and United States, between Australia and New Zealand, I would say, although they are divided by the seas, by the water. So that's where I think the challenge lies, in creating those ties between the state diplomats and the state diplomats of different countries, not so much between the citizen diplomats and the citizen diplomats, because they share the same emotions and same sentiments and the same crusade. I will not go on, because I can see there are many other hands which would raise interesting questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So should we go ahead with Patty and Professor Raj? You agree? Yes? Okay. Patty, please.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Professor Camelia, David. It's very enriching to listen to you and also listen to other colleagues, such as Professor Binod. I'm also from GRFDT, and it's been very enlightening to hear. I wanted, I think Professor Binod has pondered on the question that I had on UN systems. I think as much as I am an optimist as well, I think really trying to have seen the United Nations, studying it, in university, and then being, having had the possibility to be in some of the forums as well, I can't help but say that an institution that long, it doesn't seem to have moved very far from whatever edition of the textbook that we were given at that time. And I went to high school over 22 years ago. So I kind of tend to think that, how much more can we learn? I do believe, like you say, multilateral governance systems have a very important space, particularly for countries or for citizens that feel are agents of development and sometimes are not heard within their own spaces, but also the space where we can have sort of collective action. I was thinking about, this possibility of having that one representative, but at the same time knowing what really lacks. We've also seen what the lack has been in that one representative, right? And in this critical point in the last decade of action of the SDGs, we often have heard the local actors missing and not feeling well represented even by this one. I wondered where you saw the space then for civil society, who would sort of sometimes also, be taken along government delegations for representation, rather than be encouraged for self-mobilization, for this sort of citizen diplomacy to come out as authentic as you describe those qualities. Because I think there's something about not tainting it to be nation state if it's also allowed to self-mobilize and kind of organic. But I was also just thinking, when you talked about, elections on the African continent, I think we will have over 21 elections, if I'm not mistaken, in this year. And an article by the African Arguments, who will be tracking these elections, I think would be much more interesting to see the differences. The reason why I talk about this was, your quote to say, why are we not running? Why are we not participating? I think that when I was in my 20s, I used to think that, for instance, those who got involved in youth politics had sort of nothing better to do, were either following in the footsteps of people they had known, were tagged. It was sort of seen as a persuasion, and it was not really seen as a space of authentic ideas. I think it came at a point, at least for me growing up, when multi-party democracy didn't really seem to have had a meaning really for people on the ground. And so I think that while the concept of democracy and the election is sort of seen as the pivot of democracy, I think in a lot of ways that whole concept needs to be reimagined to look very different from whether we're looking at India or we're looking at a country like Guinea-Bissau or my own country as Zambia, or somebody sitting in South Africa, or let alone sitting in other parts of the world where it has a very different meaning. So I think that that's probably what we need to also kind of unpack and question. At the same time, also tell ourselves that for continents such as Africa, for places even on the Asian continent as well, but it's also in Latin America, to what sense can we really see these citizens, these new reformulated diplomats, feeling that they're really a part of something that would bring about meaningful change? It's as though trying to be in an old cup and feeling that you could bring about change, rather feeling quite invisible in this old cup that everybody would recognize. But also just, I thought it was really interesting, and I probably will end here, how you talked about this turning around, right? So while we want to see the states, the government, the legislature sort of as this space in which we will see change come out of it, drawing inspiration from the United Nations, I think there's also something I wanted you to comment maybe on the regional aspects as well, which becomes sometimes a much more important space than maybe before we get to the United Nations level, particularly for spaces such as Asia, Africa, and Latin America, that regional, the regional dynamics. And sort of this turning around for me is really, I want to be with you like an optimist, this powerful accelerator that I really do think that when we are exhausted with all the energy, we can't get enough energy to drive different issues, and we just see more resistance from governments and multilateral systems per se, or lack of agency. How do we turn then to these citizen diplomats across us, and how we are also able to just relearn? I thought that was really, really interesting. Last thing to say, the word itself, diplomats, and how maybe the attachment becomes very difficult. I thought, did you thinking about a new name? Does that also help? Because I thought about the word ambassador, for instance. Organizations today have what they would call brand ambassador, or somebody who's the ambassador. And somehow, while it's seen as somebody who would represent somebody who has a passion and a vision that identifies with that sometimes it's also seen to have a very high place. And so diplomat, because it has this place, becomes very difficult to see as the space you defined, a place of service. Because I'm so high up, I'm not able to see how is it to serve. So any thoughts around reformulation or retwisting words, any other words that you think, or a better definition of what you described as a citizen diplomat? Thank you so much.
So Camelia, may we stop there? I have so many questions now. I want to hear from Raj as well, but may I start to address these three sets of questions? Okay, thank you. Well, first of all, thank you so much for all of these amazing questions. I'm sure that I will not be able to do justice to all of them, but let me have a go at a few. And I want to work backwards again, if I may. And so, Patty, you have offered so many wonderful questions. I'm not quite sure where to start, but let me start at the very end and work my way backwards through your questions, if I may. And so your last question was about could perhaps a new name help, that we associate the concept of diplomat with a more elite group, perhaps ambassador? I have to say that I think that those terms might be, this is only a hypothesis on my part, but that these words are interpreted differently in different cultures. And so it might be that we don't need a uniform word that's going to connect and land for everybody in everybody's country. But I can say, with regards to the United States, I quite like this word diplomat. I think it can be reclaimed more easily than the word ambassador, only because I associate the word ambassador with even more elite. And of course, as you may well know, in my country, people purchase ambassadorships by donating money to a presidential candidate. And so a lot of people that are representing the United States as ambassadors are actually private sector citizens who just bundled a tremendous amount of money for a candidate and then got their ambassadorship. So and I also find true, like you named ambassador brand, and I associate that now a lot with private sector things. And so I don't know if it, for me, just speaking for myself, that it conveys the more earthiness that I can associate with diplomat. But let me just say that I'm still drawn to the word diplomat because for me, I think the best diplomats, the most important diplomats for me, are people whose names you will never know and whose faces you will never see. There are people behind the scenes who have devoted themselves to this act of bridge building and setting more high-profile people up to have conversations or sign treaties that would otherwise not come together. And again, I will totally accept a criticism of that. I'm putting this term in a very positive light. I'm well aware of the fact that many diplomats do terrible things and use force and coercion and gunboat diplomacy, many things that I would not associate with esteemable activity. But again, going back to that ideal thing, I'm intrigued with the prospect of this word diplomat only because I see like a career diplomatic person as a person who is devoted to the long-term commitment to building bridges. I find it very problematic when many politicians get involved as diplomats because many politicians want to leverage something in a particular time frame to win an election, or they see it as a stepping stone to another job. To me, the most important diplomats are people who see having become a diplomat as the apex of what they set out to do, and then they maximize that as they go on. But again, I would want to let everybody in different cultures like determine what word they think best describes this. And there's so many different African diplomacies and different cultural examples to draw on over the millennia in Africa. And so, I think about the diplomacy that was taking place in Timbuktu 4 centuries ago that Siba Grobgui writes about. And so that is a particular type of diplomacy where sub-Saharan and Maghrebian people came together as citizen diplomats, I would argue. But then in other cases, there were far more elite people practicing diplomacy in sub-Saharan Africa. And many of the same criticisms could be made of that term as being an elite, unreachable term as it could be in the global north. So again, I'll leave it to people to determine. So with regards to the UN, your observation, not quite sure, you were saying if in such an old cup, new change could happen. I will say that my own experience of the UN, and it is only my own experience, is that my world of the UN took place in ECOSOC. And so I was working with people who were probably the least powerful people at the UN, but I found the conversations and the engagement to be so inspiring and so lively. And so, I would find myself as a representative of the World Council of Churches, which, if you don't know, is an NGO based in Switzerland. It comes out of the ecumenical movement, the post World War II ecumenical movement, where that was really begun as a resistance to Adolf Hitler, and then and afterwards was a coalition of building bridges among Protestant and Catholic progressive people of faith to imagine a different world in Europe after the destruction of the Second World War. But I would find myself working for the World Council of Churches, where I would spend the day as a translator for an indigenous representative from a Latin American country, or I would spend the day with a indigenous young mathematician, math teacher from an island of Philippines I'd never heard of before, certainly not Luzon. And so what I saw conversations taking place, and maybe this goes to your wonderful compliment you gave me about turning around, which is something I actually just made up as I was talking to you today. But this idea of turning around and seeing all these other people that you could work with. And so I think that is maybe one of the most important things that we can contribute as students of diplomacy, if not practitioners of diplomacy, is to be looking for these other practitioners and other ways of being. Now, with regards to Africa, I must say that I've been very influenced over the last few years from the young man whose name I mentioned in my talk, Mohammed Abu Bakr from Sudan. You know, what he's reporting to me about what's going on right now in Sudan, you'll be surprised I'm going to say this now, I find very inspiring. Not the two warlord men who are tearing the country apart and who, through their own selfishness and narcissism, are drawing many people to untimely deaths in Sudan. What impresses me about what's going on in Sudan right now, or what Mohammed tells me about the neighborhood committees that are essentially running Sudan at the moment. And he says, Sudan has really not had a functioning government for about 2.5 years. And yet many of the roles that would have been traditionally played by a functioning government are actually being played by neighborhood committees in small towns across Sudan. And the average age of the person running these neighborhood committees is 17 years old. And Mohammed tells me that these young people have written something that he sees as the equivalent of a Bill of Rights. He sees it as the foundation for a future constitution of Sudan. And I'll be biased and say that I've met so many extraordinary Sudanese people who have accomplished so many things in spite of what they're facing. We hosted an extraordinary woman at one of our conferences who gave a keynote, and she was one of the cabinet ministers, Wala al-Bushi is her name, and she was the cabinet minister of youth and sport in Sudan in that brief moment before the military took back the beginning of another democracy there. And the voices that I'm encountering from Sudan, the young people's voices, I find extremely inspiring, and I see the type of citizen diplomacy that they're practicing as among the most vital and vibrant. And look at the context that they're dealing with. It's one of the most tragic current consequences taking place in sub-Saharan Africa at the moment, and yet they are doing this in spite of that. And so I'm in awe of what they're accomplishing, and I want to learn from them. They're clearly my teachers right now. So the question you asked, how much more can we learn? The Sustainable Development Goals. In terms of the construction of the Sustainable Development Goals, you said local actors are missing, and in many cases, you were talking about in terms of elections, they can be spaces that do not provide a space for authentic ideas coming from people below. And I think that, again, perhaps sometimes for me, maybe a way that I retain my militant optimism is that I don't suffer under the illusion that all of this can be changed overnight, but I take great inspiration from the small victories and the spaces that people create, these liminal spaces. Those neighborhood communities in Sudan, I'm in awe of. The spaces that I attended a class of the Iman Institute, this virtual school that Mohammed created, and I watched a class being taught by Professor Diamond from Stanford, who is one of the leading experts in how to try and dismantle illiberal democracies, and then a young human rights lawyer from Uganda who advocates on behalf of LGBTQ people and who's had multiple attempts made in his life for doing it. And these two people were teaching a class of young people on how to do the work they're doing. And there was like a young woman in a basement in Syria in the middle of a war who was taking the class. And so I'm so impressed that, I mean, to me, I think I think one of the greatest sources of power in diplomacy, particularly citizen diplomacy, is creativity. And I think creativity is more powerful than money or weapons at the end of the day, although you need to avoid being hit by weapons and you need some money in order to do some things. But what I see among these people, I could dine off that in terms of having sources of inspiration for a long, long time. But I need to be in community with such people to remember that. So this idea of, does a new name help for what we call people who do this? I think that new name is going to come from many different cultures, and it's going to have to make sense for those people on the ground. I'm trying to reclaim the word diplomat for a broader group of people, and it's already been reclaimed. I'm just conveying information from other people, really. But anyway, I hope that I've at least touched on some of the wonderful questions that you've asked. Now, going to Vinod, your really great questions. I'm pleased to meet another fellow utopian, or somebody accused of being a utopian. I always like to tell people that if you can't visualize it, then you certainly can't make it happen. And so, I want to visualize a different, I want to visualize a positive outcome in the American election in November, and I will be working in Wisconsin, knocking on doors, trying to persuade people to vote to that end. And so we all have to find our own agency in that regard. But you talked about, I like this term you used, false sense of sovereignty, and you're right, and particularly when it comes to issues of like trying to get a visa to get into another country. So many of the students that come to our school come from many different countries to be here, and the stories that they tell me about what they had to go through to get here, not terribly heartening in many respects. But at the same time, I must say that I'm of a mind that when I'm teaching a class on diplomacy, or in the past when I used to teach a class on business ethics, I would encourage my students to get a job in some of the most problematic places they see in order to change it from the inside. It's not going to change because I wrote a paper about it. And so I think that people need to get involved in these things to change. But mind you, when you're a visa officer, that is something that is hard to get away from. So your point is well taken, that in the course of the United Nations, many small countries are certainly shut out of the negotiations. And your reference to the green room and particular people being able to go and others not, sad but true. And clearly, we have to acknowledge that the architecture of the United Nations was fashioned in order to ensure the participation of what were at that time the most powerful countries in the world, who would never have agreed to be equal with smaller countries, let's be honest. And so their buy-in was purchased by giving them permanent membership on the Security Council, among other things, which I hope is going to be changed as far as expanded soon. But at the same time, again, going back to the observations by Patty, I think that we need to, I think about ECOSOC, and I think about the conversations. I mean, I have to say, I'm still so enamored, and I go, it's quite a dated observation now, but like when the Group of 77 was created at the UN, I think it opens the door to this idea of coalition building, and I'd like to see the group of 377. I'd like to see the entire General Assembly, with the exception of the Security Council members, forming a group. And I think I think bigger coalitions are possible. But at the same time, for those that are completely despairing about the UN, I still want to say that I think that if it weren't for the UN, you wouldn't have millions of children inoculated for illnesses they would have died from. There's a lot of things going on in terms of the services of the UN that still intrigue me. And when I try to work with my students to imagine an alternative to the UN, it ends up looking a lot like the UN, but obviously with different rules in place. So anyway, that's a very difficult question to have a really simple answer to. Your last point about regarding South Asia, and that there's so much commonality and there's common cultures. I've always struck by the fact that it's the intra relationships are so much more complex than the inter-relationships can be. And so those intra-relationships can be so vindictive and biting, and people can even be more righteous in their convictions about knowing that they speak for this group. And so the question then comes back to, for me, where do we find a liminal space for the intra conversations and the people involved? You know, when I think, for example, of the ongoing animosities and challenges in Pakistani-Indian relations, you know, in an ideal world, I would like to see Kashmir as that liminal space. I would like to see Kashmir as an independent country, and a space that both Indians and Pakistani people could come together and imagine a different future in their relationship. But again, now I'm being utopian, so please forgive me. but we have to be able to visualize something different, or how are we going to move forward in any direction that we're inspired to move? So I will hold my ground on being a utopian in that regard, and I will visualize Kashmir as an independent, maybe not an independent state, that might be harder to achieve, but perhaps a demilitarized zone between India and Pakistan. I'll go for that today. The third question, I think it was a question from Jeffrey, right? Right? I don't know if I'm pronouncing your surname properly. So you write, citizen diplomacy may not always contribute to democracy. Most definitely true. Witness the impact of social media, which often spreads suspicion of democratic institutions. Who manages citizen diplomacy, and how can its progressive contribution be best realized? Those are three amazing observations. Each one, I think, deserves its own response. The first one, citizen diplomacy may not always contribute to democracy. That is absolutely true in my estimation. And so I don't want to, now that I've characterized myself as a utopian idealist, I don't want to leave you with the impression that I think everybody who is a self-declared citizen diplomat is necessarily a good faith actor. And this is the tricky thing about citizen diplomacy, right? Because, you know, if you're a state-sponsored diplomat, the rules are there, and you know who is who. And like, I know who the charge d'affaires is in the Berlin embassy of France, and I can find her, look up her name, and she has a card that says charge d'affaires, and she has a phone number, and I can call her. The citizen diplomat, however, I mean, the issue, as Kostas Konstantinou brings up, of representation. How are we to understand a citizen diplomat as being the legitimate representative of a particular group? He says they're practicing everyday diplomacy if they successfully represent a group. How do we know? How do we define that term? I have to have a conversation with Kostas about that. But I do think that you know, not all citizen diplomats, I agree with Jeffrey, I agree with you, they're not all contributing to democracy. And so that means that we must become very astute students of citizen and observers of different citizen diplomats, and choose our alliances carefully and who we want to work with. Second question, witness the impact of social media, which often spreads suspicion of democratic institutions. I have to tell you that if I could take every device, now mind you, we wouldn't have our conversation right now if otherwise, but I think it's this device is undermining democracy more than any human invention that I've come across. And, you know, we here in the United States, we lament the fact that Facebook is used in so many pejorative ways, but it has been revealed to me that the way Facebook is used in Africa and South Asia is far more problematic than here. I mean, it's the major news aggregator for sub-Saharan Africa, and that is giving Mr. Zuckerberg and his friends a lot more power than they should have. I've noticed that authoritarian leaders will contract the services of Facebook in order to promote their propaganda, and so that is a big problem. And I have to say, I always like to remind people that social media is not reality, and yet it is a reality which impinges upon our 3D world to a greater degree. I know that in my own work as a canvassing organizer in the United States for the Democratic Party, I will tell you, I come to people's doors quite often in order to register them to vote, and they've been listening to Fox News. They've been listening to a lot of far-right media, and they're completely suspicious of even me being at their door. And I find that it's human face-to-face contact is actually one of the only demonstrable antidotes to the corrosive outcome of social media. And so I just want to encourage everybody to privilege more and more face-to-face conversation. And I think that there are so many ways that we communicate when we're with each other that are a powerful antidote to that. Finally, who manages citizen diplomacy? How can its progressive contribution be realized? That is a huge question. Nobody manages citizen diplomacy that I've been able to determine, but I think that citizen diplomats must be committed to creating an environment where people are respected and people are welcomed and different voices are honored. And that has to be a choice that is made by individual groups to participate as citizen diplomats in that manner. But it's not going to be regulated the way state-sponsored diplomacy is ostensibly regulated. I hope that I gave a few semi-logical answers to all those excellent questions.
Thank you so much. Let's take one more comment by Professor Raj Barduli for the sake of time. And I can imagine you must be tired also. And we should try to finish up in about 15 minutes. So please, Professor Raj. We cannot hear you. Can you open your microphone?
Oh, I'm sorry.
There you are.
Hi. Thank you, Camelia, and thank you, David, for this excellent presentation. Very, very stimulating, passionate, idealistic, perhaps in some ways, but very, charging us to take, control of the situation in your own situation area. I'm reflecting on this, that we are not talking much about the power dynamics, because here, the state versus the non-state actors, there's the whole issue of the power dynamics. How much space the state is able to release, or release for non-state actors to bring them on board in the interest of the common, in the interest of the global or the public good, or for the population. So this is a very challenging thing. They will give you a little bit of the inch as far as you can go, and then they hold their reign, and then you can't. Even in developed countries, when there was the migration crisis, the last 3-4 years, even in Greece, where they were not allowing grassroots organizations to dish out food or services to people who were stranded, or even to save them from the boats, because you are collaborating with smugglers who are bringing in irregular immigrants. Okay, that's besides the point. The thing that I want to ask is, while collaboration is ideal and desired and required for any action to really materialize, in the unequal power relations, how can collaboration take place? And even among the non-state actors, there is a power dynamics, even at that level too, because it's a question of, do I take the credibility for doing this, or do this group takes the credibility for doing this? So there is that tussle, there is this power dynamics. How does one, it's very hard to overcome, because this is human nature. But the public good and the public suffers as a result. And some non-state actors have decided to go solo. They say, okay, well, let me do my own thing. I'll help 10 people or I'll help 20 people. Forget about working with others, because it's too bureaucratic, or it takes a very long time. I want the results now. This is another situation. And then you have where there is the society as a whole approach, or holistic approach, to bring in the various actors only in the delivery of services, but not necessarily in decision-making or in the policy formulation. And this is a very serious issue now. So you can bring in the actors, okay, you can go and deliver food aid or medical aid and so on, but we make the decisions. We're not involving you. On the other hand, non-state actors do not wish in some cases. I'm from Dominica. The non-state actors are not interested in working with the state because they say they're corrupt. It takes a very long time, and we just do our own good thing. And lastly, I worked for the United Nations for a number of years, both in the field as well as headquarters. And I have to say, whatever its drawbacks are, United Nations is made up of countries, not the United Nations headquarters. It's not the institution. It's people, the countries that represent. And I think they have now laxed quite a bit in terms of bringing in civil society. There was a time when the member states, I remember, there's a meeting, no civil society can get in. But now there is a seat. But to what extent they can make a difference is, again, another issue. And it has to be at the local, national level, and not so much at setting. The UN sets, in a way, policy things. There's environment. The issue of environment wouldn't have come as far as it has, had this not been envisioned at the UN level, the various global summits and various policy forums. So, it has it. So I think we have to give credit where it is due. And not because it's my former employer, but a lot has happened. A lot is happening. Things are changing, and therefore institutions have to change, else they cannot function. So I'm not asking any questions. I'm basically saying I enjoyed your presentation very much, very well researched, very well knowledgeable, and so on. But the practical question is, how do we bring people together to work for the common good? That's so, whether it's workable or not. But thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you, CAMELIA, for organizing it.
Thank you. Thank you both. You may want to go ahead and answer this last question, David.
Well, first of all, Raj, thank you very much for your question, and thank you for your service to the United Nations. Well, you've asked the $20 million question that I'm not sure I can give you probably a satisfying answer to, but your point is your points are well taken. I mean, how can in unequal power relations, how can collaboration take place? How does one overcome this? You said it is human nature, and I agree, it is human nature in that regard. But I like what you also said about this idea that yes, small groups can participate quite meaningfully in the delivery of services, but not necessarily in the decision making that brings together the possibility of the delivering of services. I was thinking of a colleague of mine who actually until recently was on the board of the Gray School, and that's a woman named Ertharin Cousin. Are you familiar with her? She was the head of the World Food Program, and she's a remarkable woman who grew up on the south side of Chicago and became this global figure in an organization that served 80 million people on an annual basis. And, she would agree with you that, in some respects, the agency of some of these groups is in delivering services. And the degree to which one can participate in the decision-making. Clearly, I mean, for example, when she is on the ground in Yemen, delivering food to groups, and she's collaborating, for example, with the Red Cross. In fact, we had a panel discussion at our school where Ertharin Cousin and a former student of Noy Cornagos, who was one on the Marichel Relenya was her name. She was from the Basque Country of Spain. Obviously, these two women, as powerful and brilliant as they were, had no control over choices that were being made on the ground in Yemen and the participation of the different countries in that conflict. But on the other hand, their delivery of food made the difference in the lives of thousands of people. So perhaps I'll focus on that as an accomplishment, as an incredible diplomatic accomplishment. I like what you said about the UN is made up. It's not an institution, it is made up of states, and it is a space where people can have conversations, as imperfect as they often can be. And if I'm thinking about what I think is one of the more important contributions of the UN, apart from some that we've already touched upon, perhaps the one that comes to mind for me is the idea that the UN in some respects creates a common language. It creates terms that people use and that end up filtering down into many different conversations. And so when I worked at the World Council of Churches, which was actually in the 90s, and I attended those sustainable development conferences and I took people, I became very interested in the term that was emerging among some of the groups that I worked with, where they were no longer using the term sustainable development because they felt that that term had been co-opted by private sector actors. They were using the term sustainable communities. And this idea that if we're going to understand the requirements for environmental, social, political survival of groups, we must look at real communities of real people and ask the question, what do these people need? And start to address that. And I think that the UN creates a space to have those conversations, and to perhaps it's a way of a place that we can invite people to recalibrate where they're focusing their attention. Now, there is a group associated with my university, DePaul University, called DePaul International. It's based both in London and Chicago, and they are people that the Institute for Global Homelessness addresses people's needs who are unhoused in 11 different countries in the world. But they also have a lobbying arm at the United Nations, and they're trying to get the word homelessness included in the nomenclature of the UN, because there are many member states that do not want to talk about how many of their own citizens are unhoused. And so the conversations that are going around this idea of talking about unhoused people, I think, open the door to a lot of other participants. I think about the group Slum Dwellers International, which is one of my favorite NGOs. And that opens the door to other groups coming to the fore to having conversations. And so, again, I think I've offered another very inadequate answer to some very good questions and observations, but thank you very much.
Well, thank you all for bearing with us. And I will just quote from Ravinder Talwar, who was on YouTube, has been on YouTube. He was saying, congratulations. I think that comment summarizes all I had to say. As a vote of thanks, I thank David for the wonderful conference and for the patience to answer all the questions. Of course, I thank colleagues at CISAN and the GRFDT. I know it's very late in India, so I appreciate you are here. For the public, there is a link for the certificate in the chat. You can join if you need a certificate, and go ahead and register. And then the last thing, I invite you to join our weekly events and monthly. There is a next seminar on Thursday. It's called the Thursday Seminar Series with Professor Beatriz Padilla from the University of South Florida. She will speak on women refugees. And this is also an acknowledgement concerning the Women's Day on the 8th. So see you on Thursday if you can. Otherwise, thanks, David. Thanks, everyone. And I hope to see
Thank you very much. I'm so pleased to be with all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dara.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you for
Bye.
everything.